ask Jeff to jump in on this. Before we get into your viewers and the reaction to the case in general, your own reaction, I've got to admit I was a bit surprised at the verdict.
You know, it was totally surprising, except for the fact that I was watching when I was in the trial, watching the faces of the jurors, and quite frankly, they were seemingly more riveted to the prosecutor, certainly through the closing arguments, and yet I was surprised only because it was such an emotional need for the jury to find her guilty, I think based on the conduct that was introduced and the gut feeling that the jury had versus the legal responsibility that they had to overcome, and that is to say, did they meet the standard of proof? Was it beyond a reasonable doubt? And there was so much there knocking on the door, it seemed to me, that really said, no, legally she's not guilty, but emotionally they said, we just can't let her go. We just got to find her guilty somehow.
All right, well, we watched Robert Blake case where you sort of understand them saying, we think this guy did it, but they stepped up to the plate and said, no, the state didn't prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, and we're ready to open the courthouse doors. Nonetheless, that's kind of what I expected in this particular case. Cynthia was also interviewed on Good Morning America. Let's take a listen.
For 5 years, they've been investigating me in arsenic and haven't been able to find anything. They've looked in my bank records.
Who would have wanted him dead?
No one that I know of.
Do you realize that you may be spending the rest of your life in prison? How do you deal with that?
I don't right now.
Have you thought about how this verdict, the verdict of you being found guilty of killing your husband, will affect and impact your children?
It's too difficult to think of.
How are you going to explain it to them?
I don't know. I have no idea.
If you could say something to Todd today, what would it be?
That I love him, and I wish that he was here.
All right, Jeff, she talked about how she was investigated for 5 years on the arsenic. We see a lot of circumstantial cases, but usually there are pieces of the puzzle before, leading up to, during the crime itself that, when put together, paint a pretty compelling picture of a particular individual. Here, when you just look at the pieces of the puzzle leading up to and at the time of the crime, no portrait emerges. Is this the kind of case that will stand up on appeal?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I think that, quite frankly, there's a lot of issues that would be before an appellate court, such as issues of whether or not she should have been asked whether she killed her husband, as Phil did. And boy, that was compelling when I saw that. And whether or not there should have been a shrink involved or a psychiatrist indicating how grieving can occur in different ways, so the jury had that to look at. The children involved, whether or not that emotional kind of compelling issue could come into play. I know the defense attorney did bring that up a little bit in his closing argument. Quite frankly, I just think there's a lot of things that can come into play that might just make this thing come into a new trial.
Okay, we've got some great emails on this. I want to read you a couple of them. This is from Canada, from Dalton in Canada. The verdict in the Summer case is outrageous and can't be allowed to stand if one can expect any semblance of justice in the USA. Thank God I live in Canada. And Richard from Mount Dora, Florida, the Summer verdict was a gross miscarriage of justice. That jury convicted her with no proof. I think they were more concerned with her actions than any motive for killing her husband. The justice system in America really stinks. You can't even call it a justice system because there is no justice with juries like this one. Jeff, why don't you take that? What sort of consensus from your listeners?
Oh my gosh, it's been overwhelmingly in favor of a new trial. Overwhelmingly surprised and shocked that, you know, maybe she did it. I think a lot of people might still think and do think that she probably did it, but the legal system did not prove it in the way we have our legal system. And it's so important to be able to not lose sight of that, why the jury did that or how the jury did that, in my opinion, and my viewers and listeners, they're shocked. And quite frankly, I'm hearing it from people I never thought I would have heard it from. They're pretty appalled about this verdict.
Okay, Robert, I bet you and your client both were flabbergasted.
Oh, absolutely. You would have never convinced me that 12 people would find that on this evidence they proved that Cindy killed Todd beyond reasonable doubt.